Chicago, 1984. An abandoned hospital on the city's edge was supposed to be empty. Its doors locked, its wards silent. But inside, the walls kept secrets. Children who were never seen again. Files that were never meant to surface. And whispers that never stopped. Tonight we're going underground, into the hidden tunnels of Mercy Hill, to uncover the truth about one of the darkest chapters the city tried to erase. But be warned, some shadows don't stay buried. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe. Chicago, 1994. The rain fell in slow sheets, turning the broken pavement of 63rd Street into a mirror that reflected the rusting hulk of Mercy Hill Hospital. It had been closed for nearly a decade, left to rot after a series of budget cuts, lawsuits, and whispered scandals drove its last patients out. The city had sealed the doors, boarded the windows, and moved on. But the neighborhood had not. Everyone on the south side knew that children sometimes vanished near the old hospital. Some said the building pulled them in, like a black hole. Others said men in vans lurked by its back entrance, using the empty corridors as a hiding place. Whatever the truth, the fear was real. Parents warned their kids not to go near it. Teenagers dared each other to break in, only to come back pale, swearing they'd heard cries in the walls. On that night in 1994, a boy named Marcus Bell disappeared. He was 12 years old, smart, skinny, always running errands for his grandmother who lived 3 blocks from Mercy Hill. That evening, he was sent to buy milk from the corner store. He never came home. The police called it a runaway case. His grandmother insisted otherwise. She said he was a quiet boy, respectful, terrified of disappointing her. Running away wasn't in his nature. She begged the officers to look inside the hospital. They wrote it down. They did not follow through. A week later, another child was gone. Then another. All from within a half-mile radius of the abandoned complex. By the summer of '95, the count had reached 8. 8 children, all vanished, and then nothing. The cases were filed away. No bodies, no arrests, no evidence. Just names scribbled on dusty folders and grieving families left to bury empty caskets. Mercy Hill sat in silence. Time did what it always does. The city forgot. The families moved or passed away, or stopped speaking to reporters who no longer came around. The story faded, becoming little more than a ghost tale told by locals to keep kids away from the boarded-up building. But not everyone forgot. 30 years later, in the spring of 2024, construction crews arrived with plans to tear the hospital down. The city had approved redevelopment, new apartments, new shops, a fresh coat of normalcy for a scar that had festered too long. On the 3rd day of demolition, a worker's jackhammer cracked through a section of basement wall. Behind the concrete lay a hidden room, sealed shut since the hospital's closure. Inside were metal bed frames, restraints still bolted to the walls, and a dozen small shoes scattered across the floor. The police sealed the site. The headlines returned. And the ghosts of Mercy Hill were awake again. This story is about what was found in those walls, and the man who refused to stop asking questions when everyone else looked away. It is about secrets buried in dust and the price of remembering. It is about Marcus Bell and the children who vanished after him. And it begins where all ghost stories do, with the living who cannot let go. The rain had stopped by the time Detective Laura Jensen reached the construction site, but the air still smelled of wet concrete and rust. A chain-link fence surrounded the hospital, its jagged crown of barbed wire sagging in places, as though even it had grown tired of keeping people out. Laura showed her badge to the young officer posted at the gate. He looked nervous, too new for the assignment, his eyes darting to the yawning shadow of the hospital behind him. He waved her through without asking questions. The building loomed in silence. Mercy Hill was a carcass, stripped of life but not of presence. The outer walls were a patchwork of water stains, graffiti, and broken windows that stared blankly at the street like dead eyes. As Laura stepped onto the grounds, she thought of the stories she'd heard growing up, whispers about the hospital that ate kids. She'd never believed them, until now. Inside the perimeter, men in orange vests were standing in uneasy clusters, their hard hats tilted back, cigarettes trembling between their fingers. They had the look of men who'd seen something they didn't want to see. None of them met her eyes as she walked past. A foreman pointed her toward the rear of the building. "Basement," he muttered. "You'll see." Laura pulled on gloves as she descended the narrow stairs. The concrete was slick, the air heavy with mold and damp earth. She heard the hum of portable lights before she saw them. Tall lamps set up in a semicircle, throwing harsh beams across a section of wall that had been broken open. The jagged gap yawned like a wound, edges raw with fresh cracks. She ducked inside. The hidden room was small, barely 20 feet across. But it was enough. Against the walls, rusted bed frames leaned like skeletons, their restraints dangling from metal rings. The floor was littered with detritus, old gauze, cracked syringes, and, scattered in a dark corner, children's shoes. Tiny sneakers, scuffed Mary Janes, a pair of Velcro sandals with the strap torn off. Laura crouched and touched one. The leather crumbled beneath her glove. She felt her stomach tighten, an echo of dread settling in her chest. A crime scene technician approached, holding out a clipboard. "Detective," he said quietly. His voice carried the weight of what he'd seen. "There's more." He led her to the far wall. A faded chalkboard leaned against the concrete, covered in childish scribbles. Numbers, stick figures, and in the center, a word written over and over again in uneven letters. "Help." Laura stood frozen. The silence pressed in on her. This was not just a hidden room. It was a place where someone had lived, or been kept, long after the hospital's official closure. The technician cleared his throat. "Preliminary estimate, this wall was sealed in the mid-'80s. Maybe later. Whoever was here, no one was supposed to find them." Laura nodded, her jaw tight. She was new to homicide, transferred from missing persons only 6 months ago. But she knew when a case wasn't just a case. This was going to be one of those stories that consumed everything around it. She rose, taking in the room again. The shoes, the bed frames. The words scratched into the chalkboard like a prayer. It was the kind of scene that didn't just demand investigation. It demanded memory. Back upstairs, the construction crew had gathered in silence, waiting for the official word on whether they could keep working. They looked at her like children themselves, waiting for permission to pretend nothing had happened. "No one goes back in there," she said firmly. "Not until we've cleared it." The foreman nodded, relief washing over his face. As Laura stepped outside, she pulled out her phone and scrolled to the old case files she'd been given on her first week in missing persons. She'd skimmed them once, kids gone without a trace, most filed under runaway. But now the names leapt off the screen. Marcus Bell, Tanya Green, Isaiah Porter, dozens more. She looked back at the hospital, its dark silhouette against the gray sky. The city had buried something here, and it was time to dig it back up. The morning after the discovery, Laura sat at her desk in the precinct. The photos spread before her like fragments of a nightmare. The children's shoes, the rusted restraints, the chalkboard with its desperate plea. Overnight, the images had burned themselves into her thoughts, replaying in the spaces between sleep and waking. She had been assigned the case formally at sunrise. It was now hers, and already she felt the weight of it pressing down like lead. Her computer hummed as she logged into the archive system. The files from the 90s were scanned from typewritten reports, smudged with missing pages. She typed in the first name, Marcus Bell, 1994. The report was thin, Last seen at corner store. Possible runaway. No evidence of foul play, no follow-ups, no notes beyond a half-hearted canvass of the neighborhood. She pulled up the next one. Tanya Green, 1994. Same story. Isaiah Porter, 1995. The pattern repeated. Each disappearance filed with the same weary shorthand. Laura leaned back, rubbing her temples. 8 cases, all within walking distance of Mercy Hill. 8 children written off as runaways. 8 families left to grieve without answers. She opened her notebook and began writing the names by hand. There was something grounding about the act, something human. She drew a crude circle around the hospital's address and drew lines outward, connecting each missing child to the place they had vanished. The web grew dense quickly. 2 days after visiting Mrs. Bell, Laura found herself back at the precinct archive, surrounded by the stale smell of dust and paper. Rows of gray cabinets stretched into the shadows, each drawer stuffed with forgotten stories. She had already pulled the files on the 8 children tied to Mercy Hill. Now she wanted everything else. Every missing child report filed in the neighborhood between 1980 and 1995. The stack grew fast. Dozens of folders, each stamped with the same indifferent conclusions. Possible runaway. No evidence of foul play. Some were barely more than a single sheet of paper. Others contained notes that contradicted themselves. Witness statements cut off mid-sentence. Patrol logs that went missing. It was as though someone had taken a thick red pen to the truth, slashing away until only silence remained. Laura opened a file on Jennifer Clark, age 11. Reported missing in 1995. Her mother had claimed Jennifer disappeared on her way to piano lessons. The official note read, "Likely left voluntarily." No signs of struggle, but tucked in the back was a loose page, unsigned. It mentioned that Jennifer's music teacher insisted she never arrived. That detail had never been followed up. Another file, Anthony Ruiz, 13. His father had reported seeing a white van near the hospital the day his son vanished. The note had been crossed out in heavy ink, as if to erase it. Laura's pulse quickened as she flipped page after page. The pattern wasn't just disappearances. It was neglect, repetition, a chorus of voices silenced by procedure. She copied the key pages, slipped them into a folder of her own, and sat back. Someone had wanted these cases forgotten. The next morning, she met O'Malley in the precinct parking lot. He was leaning against his car, cigarette glowing between his fingers. He looked at the folder she carried and raised a brow. "Long night?" "Long 30 years, Laura muttered, handing it to him. He flipped through the copies, his frown deepening. They buried this. Someone up the chain didn't want noise. Why? He exhaled smoke, the line of his jaw tightening. Hospitals are political. They close. They leave scars. Lawsuits, unions, city contracts. If kids went missing there after shutdown, admitting it would have been a scandal. Easier to call them runaways. Laura stared at the hospital's silhouette in the distance, its roofline jagged against the morning sky. Or easier to cover up something worse. That afternoon, they visited the Greens. Tanya's mother still lived in a narrow 2-story house not far from Mercy Hill. She opened the door cautiously, her face lined with years of quiet sorrow. When Laura explained why they had come, the woman's eyes filled with tears. She ushered them into a kitchen that smelled faintly of onions and bleach. She was 10, Mrs. Green whispered, clutching a framed photo. She had a gap in her front teeth, always laughing. They said she must have run off, but she left her shoes by the door. She hated going outside without them. Do you understand? They never listened, Laura asked gently. Did anyone from the hospital ever contact you? Mrs. Green blinked. The hospital? It was closed. Are you sure? Laura pressed. The woman hesitated. Well, once, a man came by. Said he used to work there. He asked questions about Tanya. But he never gave his name. I thought it was strange. I told the police. They said he was probably a crank. Laura and O'Malley exchanged a glance. Another thread. Another lead cut short. "Do you remember what he looked like?" Laura asked. She shook her head slowly. Tall, thin, wore glasses. That's all I remember. It was so long ago. By evening, Laura was back in her apartment staring at the corkboard. She added new notes. Red string connecting Tanya's name to the mention of the man with glasses. Another string to the white van sighting from Anthony's case. The board was filling quickly, the pattern tightening like a noose. She sat on the couch, exhaustion heavy in her bones. The city outside hummed, indifferent. But in the silence of her apartment, the faces of the missing children seemed to stare back at her. Her phone buzzed. A message from O'Malley. "Call me when you can. I found something." She dialed immediately. "I went digging into the hospital's closure records," he said. His voice was taut, low. "Officially, it shut down in '84. But get this. City utilities show power usage until '96. Electricity, water." Even after the doors were locked, Laura's breath caught. Someone was still inside. Not just someone, O'Malley said grimly. Something was still operating. Laura turned her gaze back to the chalkboard photo pinned to her wall. The word, written in a child's shaky hand. Help. The room felt colder. Whatever had happened in Mercy Hill hadn't been an accident. And it wasn't just in the past. The next morning, Laura and O'Malley sat in the records office of City Hall, surrounded by the hum of fluorescent lights and the dry shuffle of bureaucratic paper. A clerk had reluctantly produced a list of former Mercy Hill employees, though half the names were incomplete, addresses outdated. Laura traced a finger down the faded print. Nurses, orderlies, maintenance staff. Some marked as deceased, others crossed out entirely. And there, near the bottom, a name that made her pause. Dr. Richard Hanover, Psychiatric Unit, terminated 1984. "Look at this," she murmured, showing O'Malley. He frowned. Psych ward doctor. Terminated the same year the hospital closed? Not just that, Laura said. But no forwarding address. Nothing after, like he vanished. O'Malley leaned back, his chair creaking. If Hanover kept coming here after the shutdown, if he was the one families saw, it'd explain the power usage. He could have been using the building. For what, though? They didn't answer. Neither wanted to. Their first stop was to track down a nurse, Evelyn Kearns, now in her 70s. She lived in a retirement complex north of the city. A quiet place with pale carpeting and the faint smell of disinfectant. Evelyn answered the door with a walker, her eyes sharp despite her frail frame. She eyed their badges warily. "I haven't thought about Mercy Hill in years," she said, voice thin but steady. "Why dig up that grave now?" Laura explained about the hidden room, the discovery during demolition. At the mention of restraints and children's shoes, Evelyn's expression faltered. She invited them in. The apartment was small but orderly, photographs of her younger self in uniform lining the shelves. She lowered herself into a chair, hands trembling slightly. "We knew things," she whispered, "but we didn't talk." "We were told not to by who?" O'Malley asked. "Administration. Dr. Hanover, mostly. He ran the psych ward like it was his kingdom. Patients went in, but sometimes they didn't come back. He said they were transferred. We never saw paperwork." Laura leaned forward. "Were any of them children?" Evelyn's eyes filled with something that might have been guilt. "There was a wing, a locked one, even after the closure notice. I remember seeing little shoes lined up outside one of the rooms. I told myself it wasn't what it looked like, that I was mistaken. But I wasn't." The room grew still. "Why didn't you come forward?" Laura asked softly. "I tried," Evelyn whispered, "but no one wanted to hear it. The hospital had friends in City Hall, in the department. When I pushed, they cut me loose. After that, I kept quiet. But I never forgot her hands twisted in her lap. You have to understand, back then, a nurse didn't have power. If I'd said more, I'd have been ruined. Maybe worse, Laura felt a surge of anger, not at Evelyn, but at the machine that had silenced her. "Do you know where Hanover is now?" she asked. Evelyn shook her head. Rumor was he moved to Indiana. Some said he died, but no one really knew. He was the kind of man who slipped through cracks. That evening, Laura sat with O'Malley in a diner off Halstead, the kind of place with sticky menus and a constant smell of burnt coffee. They spoke in low voices, the weight of the day heavy between them. "Hanover kept working after the closure," O'Malley said. "Kids in a locked wing. Utilities still running. It fits." Laura stirred her coffee absently. "But where are the records? Why was he allowed to keep operating?" "Somebody higher up had to know, or wanted to know," O'Malley replied grimly. The waitress refilled their cups. Outside, rain streaked the windows. Laura opened her folder and slid across a grainy black-and-white staff photo. Hanover was tall, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses. His expression was blank, clinical. "He matches Mrs. Green's description," Laura said. "The man who came to her door after Tanya vanished." O'Malley studied the photo. "Then we're not just chasing ghosts. He's real." Or was the silence between them deepened, the diner's neon glow reflecting in their weary eyes? For the first time since stepping into Mercy Hill, Laura felt a cold certainty settle into her bones. This wasn't a story of neglect alone. It was a story of design. And the man at the center, Richard Hanover, had left shadows that still stretched into the present. Later that night, back in her apartment, Laura pinned Hanover's photo to her board. She drew a thick red line from his face to the word at the center. Who hid them here? The board was no longer just a map of missing children. It was becoming something else, a ledger of the forgotten. She stood back, staring at the web of faces and names, the lines connecting them to the hospital, to Hanover, to silence. The city outside buzzed with life, cars rushing past, voices rising in the night. But inside, Laura felt the weight of decades pressing down. And for the first time, she wondered not just who had hidden the children, but how many had known. Laura had trouble sleeping. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling while the city murmured beyond her window. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the chalkboard again, the jagged scrawl of the word "help" etched in a child's hand. By dawn, she gave up on rest. Coffee in one hand, she opened her laptop and began digging. Dr. Richard Hanover. There was surprisingly little on him. No obituary, no medical board notes after 1984. But Laura was patient. She searched nursing journals, digitized newspaper archives, obscure county filings. At last, she found a mention. A lawsuit, 1982. A mother claiming her son had been admitted to Mercy Hill for behavioral problems and emerged worse, gaunt, terrified, unable to speak. The case had been dismissed. The boy was never named. Hanover's name appeared only once, listed as attending physician. Laura leaned closer to the screen, her pulse quickening. A second mention surfaced in an old trade journal. A brief note about Hanover presenting a paper on experimental isolation therapies for juvenile patients. The journal offered no details, but the implication was chilling. She scrolled back, reading the words again. Juvenile patients. Someone had been allowing children into that hospital, after its official closure, after the lights were supposed to go out. Later that morning, she brought her findings to O'Malley. They sat in the precinct's cramped conference room, the blinds half closed against the gray daylight. Isolation therapies, she said, sliding the printouts across the table. That's what he called it. Sounds more like imprisonment. O'Malley rubbed his jaw, frowning. And the lawsuit? Buried. Like everything else, he tapped the papers. If this is true, then those kids didn't just disappear. They were taken, experimented on. And the city let it happen. Laura's voice dropped to a whisper, or paid not to see it. The room fell silent. The hum of the radiator seemed suddenly loud. O'Malley pushed back his chair. "We need someone who knew him." Staff, patients, anyone, Laura hesitated, then said, "The State Psychiatric Archive." If Hanover was running a ward, maybe some patients survived. Maybe they remember. O'Malley gave her a grim look. "Memories like that don't fade, but they don't come out clean either." The archive was a fortress of brick and stone, its basement lined with cabinets that smelled of mildew and old ink. The attendant, a middle-aged woman with an air of permanent disapproval, guided them to a narrow room. "Files are confidential," she said, her voice clipped. "You'll need clearance." Laura held out the court order she'd managed to obtain with the precinct's backing. The woman scanned it, sighed, and handed them a box. The files were brittle, yellowed, many written in looping cursive. Patient numbers replaced names, but the notes were hauntingly clear. Subject refuses to eat. Subject cries for mother. Subject exhibits signs of trauma. Again and again, the signature at the bottom, R. Hanover, M.D. Laura's chest tightened as she read. Each file was another child, reduced to symptoms and scribbles. There were mentions of extended seclusion, soundproof chambers, behavioral modification. And then she found it. A note scrawled hastily in the margin of one file. "Do not transfer to city custody. Keep internal." It was Hanover's handwriting. Laura showed O'Malley. His face hardened. This wasn't medicine. This was containment. She flipped another page. The date. June 1995. Over a year after the hospital's official closure. Her hands shook. He never stopped. By late afternoon, the weight of what they'd found followed Laura out into the fading light. The city moved around her in its usual rhythm. Children spilling out of schools, buses groaning down cracked streets. But everything seemed sharpened, fragile. She couldn't look at a child without seeing the files, the restraints, the desperate word chalked on the wall. That evening she called Mrs. Greer again. The line clicked, a fragile voice on the other end. "Mrs. Greer, this is Detective Jensen. I need to ask you something difficult. You said a man with glasses came to your door. Did he ever mention Mercy Hill?" A pause, a breath. "He didn't have to," she said softly. "He smelled of it. That damp, moldy smell." It never left my mind. Laura closed her eyes, gripping the phone tight. The past wasn't past. It lingered in the walls, in the fabric of the city, in the air itself. When she hung up, she walked to her corkboard. The faces of the children stared back. She pinned a new note beneath Hanover's photo. He never stopped. The words bled into the silence of the room, and for the first time, Laura felt a shadow fall not just from the past, but from the present. If Hanover had escaped the record, who was to say he hadn't escaped time? The rain returned on the morning Laura went back to Mercy Hill. The construction site was silent now. The chain-link fence hung with new warning signs. Police investigation, no entry. The air smelled of wet earth and concrete dust. Inside the perimeter, demolition equipment sat idle, their long arms frozen mid-swing. Laura signed in with the officer on duty, clipped on her gloves, and descended into the basement once more. The hidden room was unchanged. The restraint still dangled, the chalkboard still leaned in its corner. But this time, Laura wasn't here to be shocked. She was here to notice. She walked slowly, her flashlight cutting arcs across the concrete. She studied the floor, the corners, the ceiling. And then she saw it. Faint scratches along the wall opposite the chalkboard. Not words, just shallow grooves, as though fingernails had raked the surface again and again. Her chest tightened. She crouched, running her gloved hand across the marks. Someone had tried to claw their way out. "Detective." She turned. A construction worker stood in the doorway, hard hat tucked under his arm. He looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot. "I shouldn't be here," he said, "but I heard you were investigating." "There's something you should know." Laura straightened. "Go on." He hesitated. "When we started the demolition, before we found this room, we kept hearing things. Knocks, like from inside the walls. My guys thought it was pipes or rats. But I swear, one night, I heard a voice. A man's voice. Low. Talking. Couldn't make out the words. Laura studied him. "You're sure?" He nodded quickly. "Scared the hell out of me." "After we broke through and found the room, I didn't want to come back." Her mind raced. A voice. In a building supposedly empty for 30 years. When the worker left, she lingered in the silence. She turned off her flashlight. Darkness swallowed the room. And in the dark, she imagined it. The scrape of nails. The whisper of a voice trapped between walls. She forced herself to leave before her imagination became too loud. Back at the precinct, she relayed the story to O'Malley. He raised an eyebrow, but not in disbelief. "Could be echoes," he said. "Old buildings make noises. Or it could be him." O'Malley exhaled slowly. "Laura, Hanover would be in his 80s by now. If he's alive," she shook her head. "You don't understand." He erased himself from the record. "People like that don't just die quietly. They hide. They survive." He didn't argue. Not because he agreed, but because he saw the conviction in her eyes. That evening, Laura pulled every scrap she had on Hanover. Staff rosters, patient notes, lawsuit clippings. She spread them across her table, pinning photos to the corkboard until the wall seemed to pulse with the weight of it. One photograph caught her eye. A grainy shot of the hospital staff at a Christmas party. Early 80s. Hanover stood at the back, tall and angular, his glasses glinting in the flash. He wasn't smiling. He looked apart, as though he were already somewhere else. She studied his face. Could he still be alive? Still watching? Still moving through the cracks? Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Stop digging. Some things are buried for a reason." Laura froze. Her heart hammered as she stared at the words. The number was blocked. No trace. She looked at her corkboard, at the faces of the children, at the chalked word, HELP. Then she deleted the message and picked up her pen. Beneath Hanover's photo, she wrote 3 words. "He is watching." The silence of her apartment seemed to deepen, and for the first time, she felt the past reaching forward. Not as history, but as presence. Laura didn't tell O'Malley about the text message right away. Something in her gut told her that if Hanover had allies, or if Hanover himself was still out there, then someone close enough to watch her movements already knew she was digging. The less she revealed, the safer her partner might be. But the message changed everything. She printed it out, pinned it beneath Hanover's photo, and stared at it until her eyes burned. "Stop digging. Some things are buried for a reason." The words weren't just a warning. They were a command. And she knew herself well enough to recognize that a command like that would only drive her deeper. The next morning, she returned to the demolition site. Rain had washed away the mud, leaving the ground slick and raw. A handful of workers lingered near the fence, restless, waiting for clearance to continue. She asked for the night crew, the ones who had been on shift when the wall was broken. A young man named Carlos stepped forward. His eyes darted nervously as he lit a cigarette. "You were here the night you found the room?" Laura asked. He nodded. "Yeah, we were breaking concrete near the north wall. Thought it was hollow. I joked it sounded like a coffin. Then the jackhammer punched through and we saw the space. Shoes, beds, all that. We backed off quick. Did you see anyone? Anything unusual before that?" Carlos hesitated. Look, I don't want to sound crazy, but 2 nights before, I saw a man near the fence. Old guy, thin, wearing a long coat. He just stood there, watching us. When I called out, he walked away. Too fast for his age, Laura's pulse quickened. Did you see his face? Not clear. But he had glasses. The kind my grandfather used to wear, glasses. Her mind leapt to Hanover's photo, the same wire frames glinting in that decades-old snapshot. Why didn't you report it? She asked. Carlos dropped his gaze. We thought he was a squatter, maybe just a crazy old man. But when we broke through that wall, I don't know. I can't stop thinking he was waiting for us to find it. That afternoon, Laura told O'Malley. She left out the text message but recounted the sighting at the fence. You think Hanover's still alive, he said, leaning against her desk. His tone wasn't mocking, but wary. I think someone is keeping his ghost alive. Either it's him, or someone wants us to believe it is. O'Malley exhaled. You're chasing a shadow. Even if he is alive, he'd be pushing 85, then explain the text. He frowned. What text? Laura froze. For a moment, she considered telling him everything, but the words stuck in her throat. If O'Malley thought she was being targeted, he might try to pull her off the case. She couldn't let that happen. Not now. Never mind, she said quietly. He studied her face, but didn't press. That night, Laura sat alone in her apartment, blinds drawn tight. The city outside pulsed with neon and sirens, but inside her walls the silence was heavier than ever. She scrolled through the files again, searching for names that might connect to Hanover, orderlies, assistants, anyone who could have carried on his work. One name stood out. Martin Kell, maintenance staff, last recorded in 1983. No forwarding address, no termination record, just gone. Laura dug deeper, pulling up property records. A match surfaced, a deed from 1997, a small farmhouse in rural Indiana. The owner listed Martin Kell. Her heart thudded. Indiana. Evelyn Kearns, the retired nurse, had said rumor placed Hanover across the state line. Could Kell have been one of his allies? Could he still be keeping Hanover's secrets alive? She printed the record and pinned it to her board. Drew a line between Hanover's photo and the farmhouse deed. The board was a snarl of string now, red threads crisscrossing like veins. The children's faces stared out from the chaos. The word help glared from the chalkboard photo at the center. Laura sat back, exhaustion hollowing her bones, and then she heard it. A faint knock, 3 raps, slow and deliberate, at her apartment door. She froze. The hallway beyond was silent. Her hand hovered over the knob, heart pounding. She looked through the peephole. Nothing. She waited, breath shallow, until the silence felt unbearable. Then she opened the door. The hallway was empty. Only a single envelope lay on the floor. Laura picked it up with trembling hands. Inside was a photograph, grainy, taken at night. It showed her, standing in front of Mercy Hill, flashlight in hand. On the back, written in jagged letters, "Stop." Her chest tightened. She looked down the empty hall, the silence pressing in. This wasn't just about the past anymore. The past was watching her. The farmhouse sat miles off the highway, tucked among rows of skeletal cornfields that rustled faintly in the wind. Laura drove in silence, O'Malley beside her, the wipers dragging across the windshield with a steady rhythm. The address she'd traced to Martin Kell was a 2-story structure of peeling white paint and sagging shutters. It looked deserted. They parked at the edge of the gravel drive. O'Malley scanned the horizon. "You're sure this is the place?" Laura held up the property record. "Registered to Kell since 1997. No tax payments in the last 2 years, but no sale either. He still owns it." They approached cautiously. The porch groaned under their weight. Laura knocked, her hand steady though her pulse raced. No answer. "Let's try the back," O'Malley muttered. They circled the house. The yard was overgrown, weeds clutching at rusting tools. A barn loomed nearby, its doors chained shut. Laura's flashlight beam caught a broken basement window, the glass jagged. A draft of stale, earthy air drifted out. Someone had been inside recently. She crouched, peering through. The basement was dark, but shapes hinted at stacks of boxes, old furniture, and something else. A corkboard nailed to the far wall, faint outlines of papers pinned in a grid. Her breath caught. They forced the back door open. The smell hit them first, mold, dust, and something sharper beneath it, like antiseptic that had soaked too long into wood. The living room was sparse. A sagging couch, a table, a single chair. No personal photos, no clutter. It felt staged, like a set abandoned after filming. They descended into the basement. The corkboard was real. Yellowed newspaper clippings covered it. Articles about Mercy Hill, missing children, and eventually the demolition. Strings connected them, red and black, forming a tangled web. At the center was a grainy staff photo of Mercy Hill, and circled in heavy ink, Dr. Richard Hanover. O'Malley swore under his breath. Whoever Kell was, he wasn't just maintenance. He was keeping track. Laura studied the clippings. Some were annotated in a cramped hand. Witness unreliable. Case closed prematurely. Hanover knows. At the bottom corner of the board was a faded photograph of a child. A boy no older than 10, gaunt, eyes wide with terror. On the back, scrawled in ink, Subject 14. Laura felt her throat tighten. They searched the basement further. Stacks of old medical supplies lay covered in dust. Syringes, empty bottles, restraints. A crate labeled Property of Mercy Hill Psychiatric Unit sat half buried under tarps. Inside were files, real patient records. Laura opened one, a girl, age 11. The notes described resistance to treatment, extended seclusion, monitoring for compliance. The last entry. Transferred to Dr. Hanover for specialized care. Her stomach twisted. "This isn't just history," she whispered. "This is evidence." A creak above froze them both. They exchanged a glance, guns drawn. Another creak. Footsteps on the floorboards overhead. Laura mouthed, "Someone's here." They climbed back up, moving quietly through the living room. The front door hung ajar, swaying slightly. Outside, the gravel driveway was empty, except for fresh tire tracks cutting into the mud. Whoever had been there had just left. O'Malley cursed. They were watching us. Laura's gaze snapped back to the corkboard. The papers, the photo of Hanover, the notes scrawled in cramped writing. Whoever had been maintaining it wasn't just preserving history. They were updating it. "This isn't Kell's anymore," she said, voice low. "This belongs to someone still loyal to Hanover." They gathered as many files as they could, stuffing them into evidence bags. The house felt colder with each passing moment, as though the walls themselves knew they were trespassing on something still alive. As they left, Laura looked once more at the basement window. The draft of stale air brushed her face, and for the briefest moment, she swore she heard it. A whisper, low and broken, rising from somewhere deeper than the house itself. "Help!" She froze, breath caught in her throat. But when she turned, O'Malley was already moving, evidence in hand. Back in the car, Laura gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "Kell's dead," O'Malley muttered, flipping through the files. "No way he's been here in years. Whoever's keeping this alive, they're close." Too close, Laura didn't answer. Her eyes fixed on the road ahead, but her mind was on the whisper, the envelope at her door, the man seen watching at the demolition site. Hanover wasn't a ghost. He was a shadow, and shadows never die. The farmhouse evidence filled 2 bankers' boxes by the time Laura and O'Malley returned to the precinct. They laid everything out in the conference room. Yellowed patient files, annotated news clippings, and the chilling photograph labeled Subject 14. Laura spread the papers across the table like puzzle pieces. The more she looked, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just one man's obsession. It was an operation. Coordinated, methodical, protected. She tapped one of the files. Look at this. Transfer notes. Hanover signs off, but there's no record of where the kids went. No hospital, no foster system, nothing. Just internal transfer. O'Malley flipped another page. His jaw tightened. And here, this one's stamped with a state seal. Juvenile Services. But the signature's fake. I checked. Laura's skin prickled. So he had someone inside the system feeding him, falsifying paperwork to make those kids vanish on paper as well as in life. They worked in silence for hours, mapping connections. Every arrow pointed back to Mercy Hill, but also outward, into City Hall, into state agencies. Laura leaned back, exhaustion pulling at her. This wasn't a secret everyone missed. This was a secret people helped bury. Later that evening, she drove alone through the rain, her mind a storm of fragments. She couldn't stop thinking about the photograph of Subject 14. The boy's eyes haunted her, wide with terror, yet eerily resigned. She stopped at a diner, slid into a booth, and spread the photo on the table. The waitress poured coffee without comment, her gaze lingering on the image before she moved away. Laura studied the boy's face. Who was he? Why label him a subject? She pulled out one of the Kell files she'd copied. Scrawled in the margins beside Subject 14's number was a single phrase. Special project. Her breath caught. She flipped through other files. Some patients were numbered, others named. Only a handful were marked with the same words, special project. Every one of them was a child. She circled the words with her pen, her hand trembling. Hanover hadn't just been experimenting. He had been selecting. When she returned to her apartment that night, the hallway lights flickered. Her nerves tightened. She unlocked her door cautiously, scanning the dark. Everything looked untouched until she reached her corkboard. The strings had been cut. All of them, slashed clean through, the photographs hanging loose and scattered. Hanover's picture lay on the floor, pinned beneath her own police ID badge. Her chest constricted. Someone had been inside. She picked up the badge, her hand trembling. On the back, in the same jagged handwriting as before, were 2 words, "Stay out." Her pulse thundered. She grabbed her phone, dialing O'Malley. He answered groggily. "Laura?" "They were here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "In my apartment." They touched everything's silence. Then his voice hardened. "Pack a bag. Stay at my place tonight. We'll figure this out in the morning." But Laura didn't move. She stared at the ruined board, at the silent faces of the children dangling by cut strings. This wasn't just intimidation. It was ritual. Whoever had done this was sending a message. The ghosts were theirs to control. The next morning, Laura and O'Malley returned to the farmhouse files. They traced the fake signatures, the stamps, the chain of paperwork. Slowly, a name began to surface. Dr. Franklin Ames, Deputy Director of State Juvenile Services, 1980 to 1990. Ames's signature appeared on multiple forms connected to Hanover's patients, transfers, waivers, closures. He had signed off on their disappearance. "He's dead," O'Malley muttered, reading an obituary. "Died in 2001, buried with honors, civic leader, family man. But he signed kids away to Hanover," Laura said. "If he was part of it, then Hanover wasn't rogue. He was protected, funded." O'Malley shook his head. "That means this goes higher than we thought." Laura stared at the wall. The faces of children burned into her mind. Hanover hadn't just been a predator. He had been part of a machine, and machines leave behind parts. That night, Laura returned to her apartment. The cut strings were still scattered across the floor. She sat among them, exhaustion pulling at her. For the first time, she felt fear gnawing at her resolve. Whoever had been in her home wasn't just watching. They were inside her world, dismantling it piece by piece. But as her eyes drifted to the chalkboard photo pinned crookedly to the wall, she felt the same certainty rise again. The children had cried for help. Their voices had been ignored. Not anymore. Laura picked up her pen, wrote across the broken board in heavy black letters, "This ends." The next lead came from an unexpected place, a retired orderly named Charles Greer. His name had surfaced in one of the files from Kell's basement, scribbled in the margins beside the phrase, "Trusted staff." Laura tracked him to a nursing home on the outskirts of Joliet. The facility smelled of bleach and antiseptic, the kind of place where time itself seemed sedated. Greer was in his late 70s, confined to a wheelchair. His eyes, cloudy but sharp enough, fixed on Laura as she introduced herself. "Mercy Hill," she said quietly. "Do you remember it?" Greer flinched, his hands tightening on the armrests. "Why are you asking about that place?" "Because children vanished there. Because Dr. Hanover's name keeps surfacing. And because your name is in his files." He shook his head, lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't know what you're asking." Laura leaned closer. "Then tell me." For a long moment, Greer stared at her, as though weighing the cost of opening wounds sealed for decades. Finally, his voice cracked. "We were told we were helping. Hanover said the children were sick, behavioral, emotional. He said normal hospitals couldn't treat them. He called it special care. I believed him." His gaze dropped to the floor. "But then, I saw locked rooms, no windows, children crying. He said isolation made them better, but they weren't better. They were broken." Laura's throat tightened. "Did you ever see what happened to them?" Greer's hands trembled. "Some were taken out at night, moved to another part of the hospital. They never came back. We asked questions once. Hanover said if we wanted our jobs, we'd stop. So we stopped?" He looked at her then, eyes glistening. "We all stopped," Laura asked softly. "And Kell? Was he part of it?" Greer nodded. "He was loyal. Followed Hanover everywhere. Said the doctor was saving them. Said the world didn't understand. Where did they go?" Greer's voice dropped to a whisper. "Underground. Not just the basement you found. There were tunnels, old service corridors sealed off. That's where he kept the worst of it. That's where you'll find what's left." Laura's heart pounded. "Tunnels," she repeated. He nodded, closing his eyes as if retreating from the memory. "If you dig there, you'll find the truth. But be careful. Some ghosts don't want to be found." That night, Laura met O'Malley in her apartment. The files and photographs spread once again across the table. She told him everything Greer had said. "Tunnels," O'Malley muttered. "It makes sense. Hospitals like that always had service routes, old steam lines. If Hanover sealed them, they'd be invisible now." Laura nodded. "And if the kids were moved there, the hidden room we found was just the beginning." Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Finally, O'Malley said, "If we go back, we don't go alone. We call in backup. CSU. Hell, the FBI." Laura shook her head. "If we hand this over now, they'll bury it again. They'll say the tunnels don't exist, or that there's no proof. We have to see it first." He stared at her, jaw tight. "And if Hanover's still out there," her voice was steady, "then we stop him." The next evening, armed with flashlights and respirators, they returned to Mercy Hill. The basement was colder than before, the air heavy with damp rot. Laura scanned the walls until she found it, a section of concrete faintly different in color, patched over decades ago. She ran her hand along the surface. "This is it," she whispered. They pried at the cracks with crowbars. Dust choked the air as chunks of concrete broke free. Behind it lay a narrow corridor, black as pitch, lined with rusting pipes. They stepped inside. The tunnel stretched on, the sound of their footsteps echoing like whispers. Old tiles clung to the walls in patches, their surfaces slick with condensation. The deeper they went, the heavier the air grew, carrying a faint metallic tang. Laura's flashlight beam caught something ahead, a door, half rusted, set into the wall. She pulled it open with effort. Inside was a room smaller than the hidden chamber they'd already found. But this one wasn't empty. Rows of small metal beds lined the walls, restraints still fixed in place. On the floor were toys. A cracked doll, a headless action figure, a deflated ball. The objects looked staged, as though abandoned in a single hurried moment. O'Malley's breath was audible through his mask. God! Laura forced herself forward. On one wall, words had been scratched deep into the plaster. Not with chalk this time, but with something sharp. We were here. Her chest constricted. And beneath the words, etched faintly but unmistakably, Hanover watches. The beam of her flashlight trembled. The past wasn't silent. It had been shouting all along, sealed in tunnels no one was meant to enter. Laura lowered the light, the weight of the room pressing in. Some ghosts, she realized, weren't content to stay buried. The tunnel bent sharply after the second chamber, narrowing until Laura and O'Malley had to move single file. Their flashlights cut weak cones into the black, the walls dripping with condensation. The silence pressed against them, broken only by the crunch of their boots on debris. The air grew colder. Laura's chest tightened beneath her respirator. She slowed, shining her beam over the walls. Faint scratches covered the tiles, overlapping, frantic. Some looked like tally marks. Others were letters that never finished into words. Jesus, O'Malley muttered behind her. How many kids did he keep down here? Laura didn't answer. She was afraid of her own guess. They reached another door. This one was heavier, steel reinforced, its surface dented from inside. It took both of them leaning into the rusted handle before it screeched open. The room beyond was larger, the ceiling low, the smell sharper, copper, mold, and something long decayed. In the center stood a single operating table. Straps dangled from its sides, brittle with age. A spotlight hung above, its cords severed. Against the far wall, cabinets sagged open. Empty jars inside labeled only with numbers. O'Malley's voice was low. This wasn't a hospital. This was a lab. Laura's light caught a folder lying beneath the table, damp but intact. She picked it up carefully. The pages were water-stained but legible. Patient number 14, special project. Subject continues to resist conditioning. Recommend escalation. Hanover present. Her breath caught. Subject 14, the boy from the farmhouse photo. She turned another page. Dates stretched years past the hospital's official closure. 1986, 1989, 1992. He was still doing this long after the city shut him down, she whispered. A sudden sound froze them both. A footstep. Not theirs. It echoed faintly from the tunnel behind. O'Malley raised his weapon. We're not alone. Laura's heart slammed. She killed her flashlight, plunging them into black. They waited. Breaths shallow. Another step. Closer, slow, deliberate. Laura flicked the light back on, sweeping the tunnel. Empty, but the sound lingered in her ears. A measured gait, too heavy for an echo, too intentional for accident. Could be a squatter, O'Malley whispered, though his grip on the gun was tight. Laura's eyes fixed on the scratches above the operating table. Words etched deep, jagged. Still here. Her skin crawled. They pressed deeper. The tunnel narrowed again, then opened suddenly into a chamber unlike the others. The walls were lined with shelves, and on each shelf sat dozens of small objects. Shoes, ribbons, photographs, a memorial, or a trophy room. Laura's hand shook as she raised her light higher. At the center of the room, propped in a chair, sat a mannequin dressed in a doctor's coat. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses perched on its face. O'Malley cursed, stepping back. The figure's head lolled forward, but something about it felt wrong. Too deliberate, too staged. Pinned to its chest was a note written in the same jagged scrawl Laura had seen before. "You're next." The tunnel air seemed to close in, pressing on her lungs. "Someone's playing with us," O'Malley said, his voice tight. Laura swallowed hard. "Or warning us." Behind them, the tunnel creaked. A faint metallic clang, like a pipe shifting, or a door closing. They turned together, lights cutting through the dark. But the way they'd come was gone. The steel door had swung shut, and from somewhere beyond it came the unmistakable sound of a lock sliding into place. The clang of the lock echoed down the tunnel like a gavel. Laura's pulse thundered in her ears as the darkness seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. O'Malley slammed his shoulder against the sealed door. It didn't budge. "We're trapped," he hissed. Laura swept her flashlight across the chamber again, past the mannequin in the doctor's coat, past the shelves of toys and shoes, to the far wall. Another door, smaller, half-rusted, but there. "This way," she whispered. They crossed the room, the floor crunching with debris. Laura grabbed the handle and pulled. The door shrieked open, revealing another narrow passage. Cold air spilled out, carrying the faintest echo of something that froze her blood. A voice. Low, broken, muttering words too faint to catch. O'Malley's eyes met hers. He'd heard it too. They moved cautiously, flashlight slicing through the dark. The tunnel sloped downward, deeper into the earth. The air grew heavier, the smell of rust and damp concrete thick. At the end of the passage stood a gate of rusted bars. Beyond it, another room, smaller, bare except for a single chair bolted to the floor. Chains dangled from its arms. And sitting in the chair was a man. His hair was white, his frame thin, but his posture was rigid, as though time itself hadn't dared bend him. Wire-rimmed glasses caught the flashlight beam. His face, lined and pale, turned toward them. Laura's breath caught. "Hanover," she whispered. The old man's lips curved into a faint smile. "You found me." His voice was a rasp, yet calm, deliberate. O'Malley raised his gun. "Hands where I can see them." Hanover didn't move. His eyes, clouded but sharp, fixed on Laura. "You've been following the children," he said softly, "chasing their ghosts. But you don't understand. They needed me." Laura's stomach twisted. "You tortured them." He shook his head slowly. "No, I prepared them. The world above was broken. Forgotten children, abandoned, discarded. I gave them purpose, by locking them in rooms, by silencing them." His smile widened. "By making them stronger. Those who survived. They carried something out of here no one else could. Resilience. Transformation." Laura's hand trembled on the flashlight. "And the ones who didn't survive?" Hanover's eyes glinted. "They became part of the foundation. Every building requires sacrifice." O'Malley's finger tightened on the trigger. "That's enough." Hanover leaned back, utterly unafraid. "You think you can end this by arresting an old man? I am not a man. I am an idea. And ideas, they live on." The words hung heavy, vibrating in the damp air. Then came another sound. Footsteps behind them. Laura spun, flashlight beam catching a shadow moving in the tunnel. A figure, tall, wearing a hood. Another behind him, and another. Her chest seized. Not just Hanover, followers, loyal remnants of whatever he had built. O'Malley swore, backing toward the gate. "We need to move." Hanover's smile never faltered. "You see? The work continues." Laura fired a warning shot down the tunnel. The figures paused but did not retreat. She grabbed O'Malley's arm. "We can't fight them here. We need another way out." They turned back to Hanover. The old man's smile had twisted into something triumphant. "There is no out," he whispered. But Laura's light caught something. A ladder bolted into the far wall, leading upward toward a sealed hatch. She ran to it, yanking at the rusted rungs. They held. "O'Malley, go!" He covered her, firing another shot as she scrambled upward. The hatch groaned but gave way, spilling a draft of cool night air into the stifling chamber. She hauled herself through, then reached back. O'Malley grabbed her hand, pulling himself up as shadows swarmed below. The hatch slammed shut, the sound of fists pounding against it echoing in the night air. They were outside. Laura collapsed onto wet grass, gasping. They were on the far side of the Mercy Hill grounds, the ruins of the hospital looming like a jagged silhouette against the stars. Beside her, O'Malley lay panting, his gun still clutched tight. For a long moment, they said nothing. Only the sound of their breathing, the pounding in their ears. Finally, Laura whispered, "He's alive." O'Malley's gaze stayed fixed on the building. "And he's not alone." Laura sat up slowly, her eyes scanning the hospital's broken windows, the shadows shifting behind them. The past hadn't ended. It had survived. And now it was awake. Chicago, weeks later. The news spread like wildfire. Tunnels discovered beneath abandoned Mercy Hill Hospital. Evidence of long-term illegal confinement. Dozens of missing children's files recovered. Investigation ongoing. The city was stunned, horrified. Reporters swarmed the precinct, their cameras hungry for details. Officials promised accountability. Families who had waited decades clutched at hope and grief in equal measure. But behind the podiums and microphones, much was left unsaid. No bodies had been found. Only rooms, restraints, files, and whispers. And though his name surfaced again and again, no one could say where Dr. Richard Hanover was now. Laura stood alone outside the ruins of Mercy Hill. The hospital was cordoned off, demolition suspended indefinitely. The chain-link fence rattled in the wind, a hollow echo against the skeletal building. She lit a cigarette, though she rarely smoked, watching the smoke twist into the cold air. Her mind returned to the tunnels, the scratches, the toys, the mannequin, and the old man's face turned toward her in the beam of her flashlight. His voice, steady even after decades in the dark. "I am not a man. I am an idea." She thought of the figures in the tunnel, their footsteps echoing, their faces hidden. Followers, believers, proof that Hanover's shadow stretched far beyond Mercy Hill. O'Malley joined her, hands buried in his coat pockets. He didn't speak at first. They simply stood together, watching the hospital loom like a monument to everything they had uncovered and everything they hadn't. Finally, he said, "They'll bury this again. Dress it up as history. Close the case." Laura nodded. "But the truth's out now. Families know. The city knows. That matters." He gave her a long look. "Does it? Or do the ghosts just find another basement to haunt?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, back in her apartment, Laura rebuilt her corkboard. Not with strings and pins this time, but with photographs of the recovered files, the rooms, the scratches on the walls. She pinned Subject 14 at the center, his terrified eyes staring outward. Above him, she placed Hanover's photo, and beneath them both, she wrote in black marker, "Still here." The board wasn't a case file anymore. It was a warning. For herself, for anyone who might listen. The city had tried to bury the hospital. The state had tried to bury the files. Hanover had buried his children in tunnels, but some things refused to stay underground. Laura leaned back, exhaustion tugging at her bones. She switched off the light. The corkboard glowed faintly in the streetlight seeping through the blinds, the faces watching her even in the dark. And in the silence of her apartment, She thought she heard it again, faint, broken, carried on memory more than air. A child's whisper, "Help." Her eyes opened wide in the dark, because she realized now, with a cold certainty, that the whisper would never stop. Not until the last shadow of Mercy Hill was dragged into the light, and maybe not even then.